On the night of August 9, 1965, a 52-year-old man sat in front of a television camera to tell his country something no leader ever wants to say. He stopped mid-sentence. He reached for a handkerchief. He wiped his eyes, and for nearly 30 seconds, on live national television, he couldn't speak at all. His name was Lee Kuan Yew, and what he was struggling to say was that the island nation he had spent his entire adult life fighting to build had just been expelled, kicked out of the very federation he had staked his whole political career on joining. At that moment, Singapore had no army, no natural resources, no fresh water of its own, and a GDP per person of around $500 a year, roughly on par with some of the poorest nations in Africa at the time, a quarter of what Britain's was. Nobody watching that broadcast, including the man giving it, expected this island to survive as an independent country. 60 years later, that same island has a GDP per person higher than the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia. It runs one of the 3 largest shipping ports on Earth. It has the highest concentration of millionaires per capita of any country on the planet. This is the story of how that happened, and it did not happen by accident, and it did not happen without cost. To understand why this crisis felt so existential in 1965, you have to understand what Singapore had already lived through twice before. In January 1819, a British colonial administrator named Sir Stamford Raffles landed on what was then a sparsely inhabited island and, seeing its position along the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important shipping choke points on Earth, established it as a free port. Ships from China, India, Europe, and across Southeast Asia could enter, trade, and leave with minimal restriction, and within decades the island had grown into one of Asia's busiest commercial centers, built not around farmland or mining but purely around trade itself. That first transformation collapsed almost overnight in February 1942. British commanders had treated Singapore as an impregnable fortress, pointing its massive coastal guns out toward the sea, certain any attack would come by water. Instead, Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita advanced south through the supposedly impassable jungle of the Malay Peninsula, crossed onto the island, and in just over a week of fighting overwhelmed a British-led force more than twice their size. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered roughly 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops at the Ford Motor Factory outside the city, the largest single surrender in British military history. 3.5 years of brutal Japanese occupation followed. For the people of Singapore, the lesson of 1942 was blunt and permanent. A colonial power that had projected total invincibility across Asia for over a century could collapse in a matter of days, and could not be relied on for protection. The post-war push for self-government that eventually produced Lee Kuan Yew's administration in 1959 grew directly out of that lesson. But Lee Kuan Yew's own rise to power was not simply a clean, popular democratic story either, and understanding what happened just before Singapore joined Malaysia matters for understanding everything that came after. In the early hours of February 2, 1963, Singapore's special branch, acting under the authority of an internal security council that included British colonial officials, launched a coordinated operation codenamed Cold Store. Before dawn, security forces arrested and detained without trial 113 people, journalists, trade unionists, and, most significantly, the leadership of Barisan Socialists, the most electorally dangerous opposition party Lee Kuan Yew's own People's Action Party faced heading into that year's general election. The official justification was that the operation dismantled a genuine communist underground network coordinating with the Malayan Communist Party, and there is real evidence supporting that the network existed and posed a real security concern. But historians have argued for decades since, and continue to argue today, that the operation's real and primary purpose was political, eliminating Lee Kuan Yew's most popular and effective rivals right before an election, under the cover of a security threat that was real but conveniently, precisely timed. Several of those detained, including Barisan Socialist leader Lim Chin Siong, always denied any communist involvement. The debate over what Operation Cold Store actually was, legitimate security response, or the first major use of the same detention without trial power that would define Lee Kuan Yew's governing style for the next 3 decades, remains unresolved and, in Singapore itself, still politically sensitive to this day. Which brings the story back to the merger that was supposed to be Singapore's salvation, and instead nearly tore it apart. In 1963, Singapore joined the newly formed Federation of Malaysia, believing that political union with its much larger neighbor would guarantee its economic survival, access to a bigger domestic market, security, a natural hinterland it had never had as a tiny island. It fell apart almost immediately. Singapore's governing party promoted a multiracial vision of the federation that put it directly at odds with Malaysia's dominant political party, which favored policies specifically protecting ethnic Malays. The tension between these two visions didn't stay confined to Parliament. In July 1964, and again in September of that year, race riots broke out between Chinese and Malay communities across Singapore. The first outbreak alone killed 36 people and injured more than 500. Curfews were imposed island-wide, not once but twice, in the span of a few months. Whatever hope had existed that merger could hold Singapore's diverse, recently arrived population together as one stable nation collapsed in the streets of Kallang and Geylang. By August 1965, Malaysia's parliament made the decision unilaterally: Singapore would be separated from the federation entirely. The word most commonly used to describe what happened is expelled, and while the actual mechanics were a negotiated separation agreement rather than a violent removal, the political shock, and the economic terror that came with it, were entirely real. Singapore was suddenly, involuntarily, on its own for the third time in less than 30 years, after colonial rule, after Japanese occupation, and now after the failure of its own attempt at regional union. The economists sent to assess the island's prospects around this period described it bluntly as a poor little market in a dark corner of Asia. Unemployment sat near 9% by official figures, with some contemporary estimates running considerably higher. The island depended on imported food. It depended on imported energy. It depended, most precariously of all, on water piped in from Malaysia itself under an agreement written into the very separation terms that had just torn the two countries apart, meaning the country that had just expelled Singapore politically still controlled the tap that kept its population alive. Kuan himself, years earlier, had described the very idea of an independent Singapore as, in his own words, a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. What Singapore actually had, in place of natural resources, was that same deepwater port inherited from over a century of British colonial trade infrastructure, a strategically valuable location along one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, and a government that had already begun laying institutional groundwork before the crisis even hit. 4 years before independence, in 1961, Finance Minister Goh Keng Swee had pushed through the creation of the Economic Development Board, a single government agency tasked with one job: drive industrialization by any means necessary, including direct government participation in building the industries themselves rather than simply hoping private investment would show up on its own. Its very first major project was almost absurdly ambitious given what it had to work with, draining 9,000 acres of swampland and forest on Singapore's western coast to build the Jurong industrial estate from essentially nothing. The first factory on that reclaimed land opened in 1963. A power station followed in 1964. A dedicated industrial port followed in 1965, the same year the country that built it was abruptly cut loose from the federation it had bet its future on. EDB officials didn't simply build the infrastructure and wait, they traveled personally to Europe, the United States, and Japan, meeting business leaders directly and pitching Singapore as a stable, efficient gateway into Asia. After independence, Goh Keng Swee returned to the finance ministry with an even more aggressive strategy, and it ran directly against what nearly every other newly independent, formerly colonized nation in the world was doing at the time. Most post-colonial governments in the 1960s protected their fragile new economies behind tariff walls, trying to nurture homegrown industry by shutting foreign competition out. Singapore did the opposite. It threw its economy wide open. No meaningful tariffs. Generous multi-year tax exemptions offered directly to foreign manufacturers willing to set up operations on the island. A government that actively courted the very multinational corporations most other developing nations were trying to keep at arm's length. Underpinning all of it was a deliberate, ruthless intolerance for corruption. Where many post-colonial governments in the region became defined by graft and patronage, Singapore's leadership pursued and prosecuted corruption at every level of government, including among its own ministers, a decision that, more than any tax incentive, is what convinced foreign investors the country could actually be trusted to keep its word over the long term. Alongside that came a deliberate investment in the machinery of the law itself, predictable courts, strongly enforced property rights, and efficient commercial dispute resolution, unglamorous institutions that rarely make headlines, but which quietly determined, year after year, where global businesses actually chose to put their money. It worked, and it worked fast. By 1975, manufacturing's share of Singapore's entire economy had climbed from 14% to 22% in a single decade. Foreign electronics firms, garment makers, and eventually far more sophisticated manufacturers moved in, drawn by the tax incentives, the deepwater port, and a workforce the government was simultaneously investing heavily in educating, deliberately in English, not just the island's native languages, specifically so graduates could work seamlessly with American, European, and Japanese firms rather than being limited to regional markets. By the 1980s, Singapore had become the world's leading producer of computer hard disk drives, an extraordinary outcome for an island that, 20 years earlier, had no meaningful industrial base of any kind. Economic strategy alone didn't explain everything, though. Lee Kuan Yew's government also completely restructured how ordinary Singaporeans lived. In 1965, only about 4% of the population lived in publicly built housing. By the 2000s, that figure had risen above 85%, through a state housing program that didn't just warehouse the poor but actively built home ownership into the foundation of the entire society, deliberately mixing different ethnic communities into the same buildings and blocks to prevent the kind of segregated enclaves that had fueled the 1964 riots. Adult literacy climbed from 73% to 95%. Infant mortality, above 26 per 1,000 live births in 1965, dropped to among the lowest rates anywhere in the world within a few decades. Life expectancy rose from 66 years to 80. Lee Kuan Yew himself described the philosophy behind all of it in a way that confused plenty of outside observers at the time. Judge a policy by whether it actually works, he argued, not by whether it looks capitalist or socialist on paper. Singapore encouraged aggressively free markets in trade and foreign investment, while the same government maintained direct, heavy-handed control over housing, infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, and long-range economic planning. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't socialism. Economists eventually just started calling it the Singapore model, and debate over whether that model is something to admire or something to be wary of has never really settled. None of it came without a cost, and Operation Cold Store turned out to be a preview, not an isolated incident. Through the decades that followed, Lee Kuan Yew's government maintained tight control over the press, restricted public protest and demonstration, and continued using the same broad internal security powers, inherited from the British colonial period, to detain political opponents without the kind of judicial process a Western democracy would require. Corporal punishment, in the form of caning, remained a legal sentence for a wide range of offenses. Singapore built what economists have since called, somewhat uncomfortably, a marriage between an authoritarian one-party state and an aggressively free market economy, a combination many analysts at the time assumed was contradictory, and would eventually have to break one way or the other. It never did. As the economy matured through the 1980s and 90s, Singapore made a second deliberate pivot, refusing to stay dependent on the cheap manufacturing labor that had gotten it started, before other nations could undercut it on cost the same way it had once undercut others. It pushed instead into electronics, biotechnology, semiconductors, and financial services, sending students abroad on government scholarships and actively recruiting skilled foreign engineers and scientists to accelerate the shift. That financial pivot became, in time, one of the largest pillars of the entire economy. Global banks now manage trillions of dollars in assets through Singapore. Insurance companies, private wealth managers, fintech startups, and international arbitration firms all cluster there, drawn by the same combination of predictable law and open capital flows that first brought manufacturers in decades earlier. Singapore today ranks among the world's leading financial centers, standing alongside London, New York, and Hong Kong, remarkable positioning for a country that, 60 years earlier, couldn't guarantee its own citizens a reliable glass of water. The vulnerability the country was born with never fully disappeared, but it also never simply sat unaddressed. To this day, Singapore still imports a meaningful share of its water from Malaysia under a long-term agreement, the same fundamental dependency that existed on the night Lee Kuan Yew cried on television in 1965. But rather than leave that exposure unmanaged, the government built what it calls its 4 national taps, imported water from Malaysia, rainwater collected through an extensive island-wide reservoir network, desalinated seawater, and a highly purified recycled water the country brands as NE water, now recognized internationally for its quality. Land itself was treated the same way. With only about 735 square kilometers of territory to work with, Singapore spent decades physically expanding its own coastline through land reclamation, building entire new districts, port facilities, and its own international airport on land that had once been open sea. That same long-term instinct shaped how the country handled its money. Rather than spending everything the boom years generated, Singapore built substantial sovereign reserves, managed through 2 state investment funds, Temasek Holdings and JIC, which invest across global markets in everything from technology and infrastructure to healthcare and energy, giving the government a second source of national income beyond taxation, and a financial cushion for exactly the kind of crisis that eventually arrived in 2020, when COVID-19 shut down international travel and trade almost overnight. Decades of accumulated reserves let the government fund an aggressive economic support package without the kind of fiscal panic many other nations faced. Appearance itself eventually became part of the strategy too. Singapore's airport, rebuilt over decades into something closer to an indoor botanical garden than a transit hub, and its reclaimed land waterfront gardens downtown, are now deliberate instruments of national branding as much as infrastructure, proof the government wants visitors, investors, and highly skilled workers deciding where to relocate to conclude that efficiency and beauty were never actually in tension. By nearly every economic measure available today, the bet paid off beyond what anyone watching that 1965 broadcast could have reasonably predicted. Singapore's GDP per person, around $500 at independence, now sits among the very highest in the world, by some measures the highest anywhere, ahead of the United States, ahead of Switzerland, ahead of nearly every established Western economy. It ranks among the 5 least corrupt countries on earth by international measurement. It produces some of the highest performing students in the world on international academic testing. It hosts the regional headquarters of the overwhelming majority of multinational corporations operating anywhere in Southeast Asia. But the story hasn't simply frozen in place as a finished success. Housing affordability has become a genuine and growing concern for younger Singaporeans, even in a country famous for near universal home ownership. The cost of living continues to climb. Political competition remains far more limited than in most Western democracies, and questions about press freedom and freedom of expression continue to draw international criticism decades after Operation Cold Store first raised them. Kuan, describing what his government had actually accomplished, once put it simply: they had built all of this out of nothingness, out of what had been, generations earlier, a fishing village of a few hundred people, into one of the most significant cities on earth. What that account leaves out is what it cost to get there: 2 prior collapses, under colonial rule and then under Japanese occupation, that taught the island it could never again depend on anyone else for its own survival, a pre-independence crackdown on political opposition whose true purpose historians still dispute 6 decades later, a merger that fell apart in ethnic violence, an economic model that depended on wide-open exposure to the same foreign corporations most developing nations feared, a housing and education transformation imposed by a government that simultaneously restricted the basic political freedoms of the people it was transforming, and a strategic vulnerability, the water still flowing in from a neighbor that once cast Singapore out, that 6 decades of extraordinary wealth is managed, engineered around, and diversified against, but never actually eliminated. Singapore is usually held up as the case study in how a small nation escapes poverty. What gets left out of that story more often than not is exactly how much control over its own citizens' freedom the government asked for in exchange, starting before independence was even declared, and whether that price was the thing that actually made the rise possible, or simply the thing that came along with it. Every claim in this video is independently sourced. If you want more untold stories like this one, subscribe, a new one drops every week.